Hello and welcome to Make It Conscious. This is Max. So today we're going to be talking about quite a difficult subject, which is the subject of evil. Is there a more difficult subject? This is what course 4 of the Know Yourself program is devoted to. So in last week's episode here, we talked about inner shadow work, which you could define as coming to terms with that which is difficult to confront in yourself. Now, of course, there's no one-sidedness in shadow work. All ideas contain their opposites, and shadow work itself is no exception. So by virtue of there being an inner shadow work, there is also what I have coined outer shadow work. So it's coming to terms with that which is difficult to confront in the world. Now, this is a very tricky subject for many reasons, not least because, well, we learn through shadow work that evil is a very nebulous subject. Not least, we all have the capacity to do harm and to do evil, as it were. And this is something we have to come to terms with. And at the same time, there is also the need to recognize and understand evil as it really is. And one of the great challenges of our culture in this day and age is that we don't really have a well-established or fleshed out concept of evil, let alone the tools for truly dealing with it in ourselves or the world. So this course builds naturally on the previous 3 courses, particularly the last one, Inner Shadow Work. Like all courses, it can be taken standalone or it can be taken in combination with the others. But if you have any encounters with narcissism or cults or controlling situations, of which, by the way, we all do, then this course might be of interest to you. Without further ado, I'll hand over to myself from several months ago to take you through the course overview for outer shadow work. So welcome and to this next course in the Make It Conscious Know Yourself program. This course is called Outer Shadow Work. What's that? Well, if you did the previous course, Inner Shadow Work, you will already have some idea. Outer shadow work is a very important topic in shadow work and in today's world, in the way it's configured. Now, there's a couple of reasons I thought this was really important to go through. The first is that it is such a cornerstone of individuation and specifically shadow work. And secondly, because it's actually something that's often overlooked and misunderstood as part of how shadow work is often taught. I touched on this a bit in the previous course. I talked about some of the reasons why this isn't looked at so strongly. So outer shadow work is confronting that which is difficult to confront in the world, or you could say externally. Because if you remember, Hollis's definition of the shadow is that which is difficult to confront in ourselves. But shadow is not purely something that exists inside of us. There is also that which is difficult to confront externally. So right off the bat here, I must make the point and reiterate this clearly that inner work is outer work. Outer work is inner work. The very notion of shadow work is predicated on this understanding of the relationship between what happens inside of us and what happens outside of us, and also the relation between what happens in our conscious mind and what happens in our unconscious mind. So there's always this relationship. You cannot meaningfully move down this path without some understanding of duality. Negate duality at your peril, or ignore the reality of duality at your peril. And this applies to every facet of experience, especially in shadow work. And so it's actually most ironic that when we talk about shadow work generally, we tend to refer only to that which pertains to our own mind. But of course, what do we even mean by our mind? Where does that start and end? And who is this I that's taking ownership of what is in my mind? So I've delineated between the two. There is no hard and fast difference between the two. As above, so below, right? This is fundamental. However, it is very important that as part of this whole program to do with individuation and self-knowledge, that we come to understand the role of evil in the world and in our own lives. Not least because evil plays such an important role, right? It's not a good role, but it's a role that stimulates path to self-knowledge, whether it's in ourselves or in the other. So just as in the previous course, we did touch on this a little bit. We touched on the role of what we encounter in the negation, the emphasis being, what does this show me about myself? But nonetheless, always understanding how it's our experience that gives rise to this insight. In this course, we continue on the very same theme. However, we're now starting to look also at what is actually occurring outside and coming to understand ourselves again through that. So we're going to be talking about evil, the nature of evil. We're going to be talking about narcissism, which, in itself is a very sort of trendy topic. And 10 years ago, most people, I think it's fair to say, probably didn't know what narcissism was. Even today, one of the main challenges is that a lot of us know what narcissism looks like. We have some sort of vague sense of what it means, this grandiosity, this selfishness, a lack of empathy, but okay, what does that look like? So we understand how it appears, maybe even in a sort of caricaturial way, but this is actually somewhat useful, sure, but also somewhat misleading, because by its very nature, evil is hidden. It morphs, it changes. It has to remain quiet and slithering and hidden for the very reason that it has no real strength. It's fundamentally based on a weakness. But we give it strength by projecting our own strength onto it and by being ignorant of what it really is. And so there's actually kind of like a very strange movement that's occurring in our world, certainly in the Western world, which tends to pathologize or medicalize that which is actually just a misuse of free will, i.e. a violation of freedom. There's many reasons for that. One reason is that a lot of our world is controlled by folks who are doing just that, whether they realize it or not. A second reason is that I think there's an overall kind of call to selfhood that's bubbling under in a relatively small number of folks, sure, but it's probably still more than it's ever been, certainly in absolute terms, maybe even in percentage terms, that there's a greater possibility to realize oneself through an ever-increasing number of means. Talk about the long tail phenomenon in marketing. This is just nothing more than a reflection of ever greater expression, ever greater self-realization. But by the same token, there's even more traps, and there's even more decadence and even more debauchery, and there's all these other ways of getting caught up and of violating freedom. So there is this call, and you can even think about this in sort of spiral dynamics terms. If you're familiar with this model, that's quite a useful way to think about it too. Again, just another model, but essentially there's this move from, broadly speaking, in the West, we've gone through this period of apparent economic growth, these several decades of creating the good life, wrangling with the world to make it meet our preferences, doubling down on that to the nth degree, and now starting to realize ever more problems associated with that. It's always been pretty clear that there's externalities associated with that, but now it's becoming really clear, not least in the environment and eco side, but also socially. The cost of living has just risen up. What's that about? How on earth can that happen? It's meant to be economic growth. It's meant to rise all ships. And yet the average person in most Western countries is feeling the pinch. So what's going on there? Well, it's a doubling down on images at the expense of the real thing. We've pursued economic growth, forgotten about what it really meant and why we're really doing it, and it's created externalities across the board. So that creates a tension, gives rise to a tension and an antithesis, and things have to change. But largely what that's meant is not really a paradigm shift by any stretch, but moreover a kind of just an exaggerated opposite. So like swinging back from orange to green in spiral dynamics terms. So even though this alternative of egalitarianism, humanitarianism, like no one left behind, everyone must be nice to each other all the time, don't you dare ever be unkind, that is, if anything, more ironic as a way to try and approach life. But what that's also meant is that there's a widespread inclination to just avoid ever judging anyone, because that would just be awful, wouldn't it? Just to call someone out on their misbehavior would just be so counter to our cultural persona. Like, how dare you judge someone? Everyone's different. Everyone has value. Of course they do. Or even everyone's equal. Well, it depends what you mean, doesn't it? Everyone certainly does and should have equal rights. But that's completely incompatible with other forms of equality. So there's this intrinsic denial of certain facets of reality within that. And moreover, there's this just complete aversion almost to calling misbehavior what it is, to calling evil what it is. And the more we misunderstand evil, the more it can really get a grip on us. Bearing in mind that people have always had some intuitive sense of evil. There's always been the shadow archetype. Humans have always come up against antithesis. But not always have we had the ability to truly understand what evil is from a philosophical perspective. By and large, I've done this myself, I've made comments or Facebook posts about evil. I've had questions back that sort of said, well, I don't really think evil exists. And there's some sort of perverted kind of wisdom in that, I suppose. Just like every comment contains some truth and some falsity, even if it's not true in the literal sense, it must reflect something that's true. And in a similar way, the idea that evil doesn't exist, well, what do we mean by exist? It's a concept. Sure, it's a concept, but it has some kind of grounding in a phenomenon that is real. And we do well to really understand it. So I'll talk about narcissism because even though that's a sort of trendy word, and we all like to maybe watch YouTube videos about it and understand encounters we've had in light of those facts, it can be really helpful actually to see it from a psychospiritual perspective, not merely a medical perspective. God, no, that's not really going to help us much, because that's pretty much just a list of, okay, it looks like this, it doesn't look like this, if it ticks these boxes. If they get 30 points out of 40 on the O'Hara checklist, they're a psychopath. But in some countries it's 35, and if they're 29 and a half, then fill your boots. So that has very limited use, not least because, and here's the key, our encounters with evil change us as people. You cannot embody that same change purely by reading a book about it. And you know who is reading books about it? It's the very perpetrators themselves, of which, by the way, we all have. We all have done harmful things. We all do evil. You might say we all have evil inside of us, but what that exactly means, we need to actually explore the nuance there, because there's a big difference between having some evil proclivity, having some potential to do harm, which we're all born with and may well have ironed out to a large practical degree, versus the lack of empathy and the total pathology that does exist in certain individuals. There's this concept Paul Levy talked about, wettico, which is like the mind virus. We're going to be talking a bit about that, but just touching on it very briefly, it's this mind virus in his idea that can affect anybody. But there's also the fact that there are full-fledged wetticos. There are folks who have zero empathy and pretty much engineer their entire lives around causing pain to other people. Of course, they dress it up differently. Of course, they lure them in with attractive treats. But ultimately, their will, perhaps if they don't even realize it, is to bend the world to their own egocentric needs. They're trying to bend what is absolute around their own personal preferences, which are invariably born in trauma, the avoidance of pain. Yeah, to an extent, understandable. But it does come to a point where one, as an adult, is able to make a choice of, do I confront what is haunting me? Do I work through this pain? Or do I just make a firm stance right now to never, ever, ever go near there and just forever bypass, cut off, suppress, and manipulate, gaslight, and mold the world and other people to that project of self-avoidance? So there is a quantitative and qualitative difference between people in this regard. And it helps no one to just say, oh, well, everyone's different, but everyone's equal. And everyone has different values, and let's just leave it at that. That is a total bypass, and it gets us nowhere. So this is what this course is about precisely. So the course aims then, one, we're going to develop a nuanced philosophical, psychological, and spiritual understanding of the nature of evil, because it does have a nature, and we have to understand it from many perspectives to really get a grasp on what it is. Two, intricately understand the mechanics and dangers of codependent, abusive, power control dynamics in both narcissist and cult abuse situations. So here was, again, the point I was just making is that what seems like a sort of isolated topic around narcissism is actually part of a much wider spiritual discussion that has great bearing on the very trajectory of our world. This is not just some niche topic on YouTube that some people take an interest in. It is the physical manifestation of an energy that must be understood if we are to do our own inner work and if our civilization has any hope of being preserved. I'm referring back to the quotes by Jung and von Franz there. But make no mistake, despite the fact that they didn't really talk about it much, their onus was on inner shadow work. However, understanding evil and understanding narcissism is a key part of that. And the difference between, say, narcissistic abuse and cult abuse, quite simply, is the number of people involved. They're both power dynamics. They're both based in an interaction with someone who is seeking to placate their own coming to consciousness, is using freedom to violate freedom. So these are just the ways in which this thing appears in the world. They are intrinsically linked. Both are a form of narcissistic abuse. The difference is whether it's a one-on-one or a group situation, and maybe even the kinds of flavors in which it shows up, the kinds of themes that are involved. We're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about the types of cult, whether it's spiritual, financial, self-help, this kind of thing, a family. But to all intents, you talk about one, you're talking about the other. Okay, so thirdly, gain insight into your inner workings and role. This is what it's all about, right? This is, well, be careful of my words. It's not all about that. How could it be? Because nothing is one-sided. But of course, we are the ones coming to self-knowledge. As we do so, the world around us will also change. But it's always coming back to this emphasis that we got involved in these situations for certain reasons. What those reasons are, that's your work, that's my work to figure out. What it means for us, how we can transmute and integrate that experience. So fourth, break free of these dynamics for good. We always have a role in it, and it's also up to us to understand that and make good of it going forward. Break free of these dynamics. We can opt out of master slave dynamics at all scales and in all flavors. But the key here is that it must be based in an understanding of the reality of this phenomenon. It's not simply enough to know what it looks like. It's not simply enough to read books about it. It's not simply enough to watch YouTube videos about it. Do you think when the People's Temple cult was a thing and came together that those people weren't already aware of other kinds of situations like this, or that the dangers of obedience in spiritual groups and this kind of thing? Admittedly, that was a relatively early and quite extreme form of what we're talking about. But one of the very survivors said, no one joins a cult. Cults don't look like cults. It's not whether they tick the right boxes that is the problem here. It's our own perception, in part, and it's also the misunderstanding of what they are at their core, fundamentally, because guaranteed, these dynamics, whether narcissistic one-on-one or cultic abuse situations, these will continue to happen over time. They will always be taking new forms. They will always find a new camouflage. As long as people do not integrate what they need to integrate, they do not make conscious that part of themselves that led to that situation, then the world will find a way to bring it out of us. This is the role of evil. This is how it works. So those are the four aims. This course is about narcissistic abuse recovery, cult abuse recovery, but moreover, it's about using these experiences as a way to gain self-knowledge and transmute those experiences. So we're going to end this first lesson on a quote from Murray Stein, famous Jungian analyst, of course. In his series, or in his book called Individuation, he said, "Betrayal shatters the precious and often sacrosanct images a person has lived by, hoped in, found guidance from, and trusted. The idealized transference object is broken, and another reality is presented, a reality that shows the shadow beside the persona, the depths of pathology in the human condition alongside its nobility and glory, the destructive element in God beside the creative, the hateful beside the loving. It is a hard vision to bear, but it is the only way to go on from betrayal toward wisdom and further life." And this is part of his essay on betrayal and individuation, I believe it's called, wherein he is making this point that if you've encountered some kind of serious betrayal at some point, welcome to the club. This is part of the individuation journey. So here we have a very prominent Jungian analyst who's speaking to this message around outer shadow work. He's not saying, I mean, I'm sure there's many morally suspect folks out there who would just love to say, you're just pointing the finger outwards. I welcome them to say that, because they're really just exposing their own misunderstanding of what I'm saying and their own willingness to try and avoid that reality in themselves. And if anyone was motivated to make such a comment, well, I'm not holding my breath for them to show any self-insight into why they might be asking that question. So clearly this is about a two-sided project, and encountering betrayal, this projection withdrawal that must occur, this idealized transference object being broken, and that libido traveling back along the very same path along which it initially went, showing the darkness alongside the persona, showing the shadow alongside the persona, and the depths of human pathology. And we have to come up against this thing because it gives us a very rude wake-up call as to the extent that humans are willing to go to protect their self-image, the harm they're willing to do. But not only that, the extent that some are willing to go to cultivate their self-image as a way to specifically divert away from this fact. Not just from you, but from themselves as well. And it's quite remarkable to see that extent. And it can take some time to assimilate, because you may well have spent your life projecting your own goodness out into the world. This is the whole other side of projection that is rarely considered, right? Projection is often assumed to be that you're just seeing your own unconscious qualities that are negative or destructive, and you're doing so out as a kind of defense mechanism. But hey, projection can be not only consciously done, it can be good qualities, and it can be part of the whole process of developing self-knowledge. So all three of those qualities have an opposite. Thus, this gives rise to, in my mind, 8 kinds of projection. Not least the simply projecting good qualities onto someone who maybe symbolically forms a kind of hook for it, but is, if anything, just doing it superficially, for the very reason that they know that you want to project that side of you. And unconsciously, they want that part of you as well. So there's this duality that goes on where they're also very attracted to you because they want to extract your goodness. Now, I'm not assuming that my audience here are all good, by the way. In fact, I know that courses like this are often very popular with those who are simply looking for ways to upgrade their guise. So be it. But I do know that the majority of you are coming to this because you are genuinely interested in self-knowledge, you have empathy, and most likely you've encountered something like what I'm talking about. And it was probably one of the pivotal influences on your overall direction. And maybe there's still work to be done. Well, good. You're in a place that's going to help you with that. That's my intention. That's my commitment. So thank you for your time and attention. Looking forward to seeing you in the first module, The Nature of Evil. That brings us to the end of this episode. So thank you for your time and attention. If you enjoyed it, then please leave me a like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. If you're listening to this on the podcast, I always appreciate ratings and reviews as well. For the Know Yourself program, simply head over to knowyourself.makeitconscious.com, and I'll see you soon.